They didn't stop him because he was dangerous. They didn't stop him because he broke the law. They stopped him because he was black, and because, in their eyes, that was reason enough. One ordinary afternoon, a grocery bag in one hand, heart medication in the other. And suddenly, cold metal cuffs biting into aging wrists as strangers watched. Some filming, some silent, some relieved it wasn't them. A man who had given decades of his life to this country was reduced in seconds to a suspect, his dignity treated as disposable. This is not just a story about a racist police encounter. This is a story about what it costs to exist while black in America. About how calm obedience doesn't protect you. About how respectability doesn't save you. About how silence, yours, mine, everyone's, allows injustice to breathe. And then, something happened no one in that small town expected. An arrest meant to disappear quietly triggered a response so powerful it shook the entire system. A moment meant to humiliate became a reckoning, and the truth they tried to bury forced its way into the light. Before you keep watching, subscribe to the Racist Reality channel, because stories like this are real. They are happening now, and they demand to be seen, felt, and understood. This channel exists to expose racism, confront injustice, and remind us that empathy is not weakness. It is power. Stay with this story, because what begins with handcuffs will end with a question that reaches straight into your conscience. What would you do if this happened to someone you loved? The doors explode open. The doors of the Redfield County Sheriff's Office didn't creak or swing or politely open the way doors were supposed to in small towns that prided themselves on manners. They burst. Metal slammed against concrete walls with a violence that startled everyone inside. Conversations died mid-sentence. A deputy's laugh cut off like a cord had been yanked from his throat. Papers fluttered to the floor. A chipped mug tipped over, coffee spreading slowly across a desk no one bothered to clean. Then came the sound that didn't belong in Redfield. Boots moving fast, measured, synchronized. Not the casual shuffle of local deputies. These were boots trained for urgency, for consequences. Black tactical uniforms filled the entryway. Yellow letters glaring under fluorescent lights. FBI. Radios crackled in clipped tones, words coded and efficient, carrying the weight of authority that did not ask permission. The air itself seemed to tighten, thick with the knowledge that whatever normal existed in this building a moment ago had just ended. Behind them walked a woman who did not rush. Claire Whitman, FBI director. She didn't need a weapon in her hands to command the room. Her presence did that for her, calm, focused, controlled. The kind of control that came not from dominance, but from certainty. Certainty that when she spoke, things would happen. Her eyes moved once across the room, not hurried, not curious. She wasn't here to observe. She was here to correct something. Then her gaze stopped. In the far corner of the station, on a narrow metal bench that felt colder than it should have, sat an elderly black man. His hands were cuffed in front of him, wrists already marked by angry red impressions. His back was straight, shoulders squared not in defiance, but in habit, an old discipline carved into muscle memory over decades. He did not slump. He did not plead. He did not look afraid. But there was a quiet exhaustion in his eyes that no uniform could hide. "Remove those cuffs." The words weren't loud. They didn't echo. They didn't need to. They cut through the room with surgical precision, landing exactly where they were meant to. No one moved. A few deputies exchanged glances, unsure whether to act or wait for permission that suddenly felt irrelevant. Sheriff Frank Holloway, half risen from his chair, looked like a man whose authority had evaporated before he could grasp what was happening. "Now," Whitman said again. An agent stepped forward immediately. The cuffs came off with a sharp metallic click that echoed far louder than expected. The sound lingered, bouncing around the room like an accusation. The man flexed his fingers slowly, as if testing whether they were truly his again. "That man," Whitman said, turning to face the room at last, "is Eugene Walker." She paused, not for drama, but because some truths deserve space to breathe. "And every second he spent restrained in this building will be examined under federal civil rights law." A ripple moved through the deputies. Confusion, disbelief, fear. Someone swallowed hard. Someone else looked at the floor. Whitman's gaze sharpened. Who arrested him? Officer Travis Cole shifted near the back, jaw tight, posture defensive. He had the look of someone accustomed to being backed up, not questioned. We did, he said. My partner and I. And on what grounds? Whitman asked. Cole lifted his chin slightly. Suspicious behavior. He matched a description. The words fell into the silence like a match dropped into dry grass. A description, Whitman repeated, stepping closer. Of what? Cole hesitated. Just a fraction. But hesitation was enough, because everyone in that room knew the answer. Whitman didn't raise her voice when she spoke again. That would have been too easy, too familiar. Because from where I'm standing, she said, the only description that seems relevant here is black. Elderly. Alone. The room stiffened. She turned back to the man who had been sitting quietly, absorbing the chaos as if he had lived through louder, darker moments before. Mr. Walker, she said more gently, are you injured? Eugene Walker shook his head once. Just sore wrists, Director. The word landed heavy. Director? Sheriff Holloway repeated, voice thin. Whitman turned on him then, and the difference between local power and federal authority became unmistakably clear. Yes, Sheriff, Director. She gestured lightly toward Gene. And the man your deputies decided to treat like a criminal instead of a citizen is a retired Chief Master Sergeant of United States Air Force Intelligence. He advised administrations you once voted for. He helped design systems that are still protecting this country. She paused, then added deliberately, and none of that should matter. Gene's eyes flickered, just slightly. Because even if he were a man with no medals, no rank, no connections, what happened here would still be wrong. That truth hung in the air, heavier than the earlier accusations. 30 minutes earlier, Gene had been sitting in the back of a patrol car, heart beating against ribs that had endured worse than this. He remembered the smell of disinfectant, the way the vinyl seat stuck to his skin, the way the young officer in front spoke about him like he wasn't there, always walking around like he owns the place. Gene had wanted to laugh at that. Ownership, in a country he had spent 35 years defending while being reminded again and again that it never fully claimed him back. Now the same town that had watched him be handcuffed was watching federal agents flood its police station. Cameras flashed through the windows, phones buzzed, news vans crowded the street outside. Redfield, North Carolina, a town that liked to believe it was fair, had been forced to look at itself. Whitman turned to her agents. Secure all body camera footage, all arrest reports, all internal complaints for the past 5 years. We are assuming temporary control of this department under Department of Justice authorization. Sheriff Holloway lowered himself into his chair, suddenly older than his 58 years. This is unnecessary, he muttered. We can handle this internally. Whitman's response was immediate. You already did. That's why we're here. Gene finally spoke again, his voice steady, calm, and far more dangerous than anger. Sheriff, he said, I didn't move to Redfield to make trouble. Holloway looked up, really looked at him now, not as a detainee, not as a problem, but as a man whose calm carried weight. I came here for peace, Gene continued, for quiet, for a chance to grow old without feeling like I was still on patrol. He paused, then added softly, what happened today wasn't about me. It was about what this town has decided is acceptable. No one argued. Outside, the steady thrum of helicopter blades slowed. Inside, something deeper than fear settled into the room. Gene Walker stood free, wrists aching, dignity intact, but with a truth pressing hard against his chest. If he had not been who he was, none of this would be happening. That knowledge hurt more than the cuffs ever could. Because for every Gene Walker, there were countless others whose names never triggered alerts, whose fingerprints didn't summon helicopters, whose pain stayed invisible. And as the federal agents moved through the station, documenting, recording, reclaiming what had been abused, Gene understood that his story was no longer just his own. It was a mirror, and America had been forced to look. A man who lived like he still had orders. Eugene Walker woke before the alarm because his body had never learned how to sleep past duty. 5:30 in the morning came whether he asked for it or not. His eyes opened in the half-dark, breath steady, heart already counting time the way it had for most of his life. For 35 years, mornings had belonged to the Air Force. Even now, long after retirement papers had been signed and uniforms folded away, the habit remained. Quiet, insistent, unyielding. He sat up slowly, feet touching the floor at the same angle every morning. The house was silent in that particular way only widowers understood. Not empty, just quieter than it used to be. Margaret's side of the bed was still made. He hadn't slept on her pillow since the day she died. 3 years had passed, but grief didn't follow calendars. It lived in the small things. The extra mug in the cabinet he never reached for, the second toothbrush still tucked in the holder, the instinct to turn and say good morning to someone who no longer answered. Gene stood and made the bed with care, hospital corners tight, the way he'd been taught as a young airman when mistakes earned push-ups and pride was measured in precision. He smoothed the comforter once, twice, until it lay flat and obedient. Order mattered, it always had. In the bathroom, the mirror reflected a man who looked older than he felt and younger than his memories. 68 years etched into deep lines at the corners of his eyes, silver threading through his closely cropped hair. His face carried history, not just his own, but a nation's. Wars fought quietly, rooms entered carefully, respect earned and still, somehow, conditional. He shaved slowly, methodically, not because anyone would see him, but because dignity didn't require an audience. The house on Maple Street was modest. One story, white siding, a small porch where Gene liked to sit in the evenings with a book he sometimes forgot to read. When he'd moved to Redfield after Margaret's death, he'd chosen it for its quiet, its affordability, its proximity to the VA clinic. He had not chosen it for its honesty. The walls inside were lined with photographs arranged with exact spacing, each one straight enough to satisfy an inspector. Gene in dress blues, shoulders squared, medals catching the light. Gene shakes hands with men whose names filled history books, but whose voices he remembered as just voices, speaking urgently behind closed doors. One photograph sat slightly apart from the rest. Gene and Margaret on their wedding day. Her smile was wide, unguarded, his softer than it ever was anywhere else. Another showed their son, Daniel, graduation cap tilted just enough to suggest rebellion. Gene remembered how heavy his chest had felt that day. Pride mixed with worry, because being a black lawyer fighting for civil rights in America required courage Gene knew too well. A shadow box hung in the living room, glass polished daily. Inside were the remnants of a life lived in service, medals, ribbons, insignia, and a folded American flag, crisp and triangular. Visitors sometimes stared at it longer than they meant to, unsure what to say. Gene never explained it. People were quick to praise service, slower to respect the person who had given it. In the kitchen, Gene prepared his coffee the same way he always did. 1 level tablespoon of grounds. Water filled precisely to the 6th cup line. Timer set. He'd learned long ago that rituals anchored you when the world refused to. While the coffee brewed, he stepped outside to retrieve the morning paper. The North Carolina air already clung to his skin, heavy with humidity and promise of heat. Cicadas hummed in the distance, relentless, like time itself. The headlines were predictable. Budget debates, school board meetings, a feature on the upcoming summer festival. And tucked just beneath the fold, almost like an afterthought, Sheriff's Department increases patrols in high-activity areas. Gene exhaled slowly. He didn't need to read further to know which neighborhoods would see more blue lights and fewer explanations. He had moved south looking for peace. Washington, D.C. had been loud even after retirement. Too many ghosts, too many reminders of the life he'd lived in shadows. Redfield on paper had looked like an ending, a place where he could be an old man instead of a former intelligence asset. What the brochures hadn't mentioned was the tension that lived just under the surface, the way smiles sometimes tightened when he walked by, the way conversations stopped a second too late, the way police cruisers seemed to idle longer near his street. None of it was new. Gene had been navigating white spaces since he was 18 years old, learning early how to make himself non-threatening without making himself small. He'd learned to speak calmly even when insulted, to move deliberately, to document everything, to survive systems that never quite decided what to do with a black man who excelled. He folded the paper neatly and sat in his recliner, staring out the window as the coffee finished brewing. Thursdays were routine: groceries, pharmacy. Back home before noon, routine was safety. Gene dressed carefully, pressing khaki slacks and a pale blue button-down shirt. He chose shoes he'd polished the night before, though they were 10 years old and perfectly broken in. Appearance mattered, not because it guaranteed respect, but because it denied easy excuses. In his wallet, he checked for everything twice: driver's license, VA ID, insurance card. Old habits died hard. He slipped the wallet into his pocket alongside a neatly folded grocery list, Margaret's handwriting copied long ago, her instructions remembered even now. "Always go in with a plan," she used to say. "That way no one can say you don't belong." The Buick started on the first try, as it always did. 10 years old, well-maintained, reliable. Gene liked things that did what they were supposed to. The drive into town took 7 minutes. As he pulled into Wilson's grocery, Mrs. Wilson herself nodded from behind the counter. "Morning, Mr. Walker," she said, a practiced smile but not unkind. "Morning," Gene replied, returning it. Some people in Redfield were genuinely decent. Others were polite in a way that kept distance intact. And then there were those who watched him like he was a question they didn't want to answer. Gene moved through the aisles methodically. Vegetables first, chicken breasts on sale, orange juice, whole grain bread. He exchanged small talk where it was offered and silence where it wasn't. At the checkout, a young man glanced at Gene's VA cap. "You serve, sir?" he asked. "Yes," Gene replied simply. "Thank you for your service." Gene nodded. He'd learned not to unpack that phrase. Gratitude was easy. Equality was harder. From there, he drove the short distance to Thompson's pharmacy. As he pulled into a parking spot, he noticed the cruiser. It sat angled just enough to see him. 2 officers inside, watching. Gene felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the one that had nothing to do with age or heart condition. It was recognition, a lifetime of it. He stepped out of the car anyway, movements measured. Inside the pharmacy, Dr. Thompson greeted him warmly. "Blood pressure still behaving, Mr. Walker?" "Steady," Gene replied. "Discipline helps." When he turned to leave, the officers were inside now, pretending to browse near the entrance. Their eyes followed him, assessing, weighing, deciding. Gene straightened slightly, not in defiance but in preparation. He had seen that look in Vietnam, in Europe, in Washington, in places where danger wore uniforms and places where it wore smiles. The look that asked not who you are, but what are you doing here? As he stepped back into the parking lot, grocery bags in hand, Gene had no way of knowing that the quiet life he had worked so hard to earn was about to be interrupted violently. He only knew this: he had done everything right. And in America, that had never been a guarantee, because dignity for men like him was not protection. It was resistance. The town that smiled with its teeth, clenched Redfield, liked to think of itself as a good town. It said so on the welcome sign just past the county line. Redfield, a place to call home. The letters were freshly painted, the flowers beneath them rotated seasonally by the garden club, and every year someone posed in front of it for graduation photos, engagement announcements. Smiling like belonging was automatic. For some people it was. For others, belonging was conditional, granted in pieces, withdrawn without warning. Gene Walker felt that truth in the air long before he could name it. It lived in the way conversation softened when he approached, then resumed once he passed. In the way clerks sometimes watched his hands more closely than his face. In the way police cruisers seemed to idle just a little longer on Maple Street, engines humming like reminders. Redfield wasn't loud about its prejudices. It didn't need to be. It had learned over generations how to wrap suspicion in courtesy, how to disguise exclusion as concern. People smiled here. They just didn't always mean it. Gene noticed it first at church. He attended occasionally, slipping into the back pew out of habit. Ushers were polite but distant. Parishioners nodded, then turned back to their conversations. No one asked where he was from. No one asked why he'd come. It was as if curiosity itself had limits. At the hardware store, a man once asked him if he was visiting family. Gene answered honestly that he lived here now. The man laughed lightly, as if Gene had made a joke without realizing it. At the diner on Main Street, Gene ordered black coffee and eggs over easy. The waitress was kind enough, but she always refilled his cup last. It was subtle. Everything in Redfield was subtle. That was how the town stayed comfortable with itself. The police department reflected that same quiet certainty. Redfield County Sheriff's Office wasn't large, but it was visible. Patrols had increased over the past year, especially in neighborhoods like Gene's. The justification was always the same: proactive policing, community safety, preventive presence, words that sounded responsible, words that rarely came with explanations. Gene read about it in the paper, heard it whispered in grocery aisles. I noticed it in the way neighbors waved from porches but didn't linger. Some were genuinely friendly. Others were simply relieved that he didn't cause problems. Respectability has its limits. He had learned long ago that being quiet, neat, disciplined did not erase skin color. It only delayed confrontation. In Redfield, law enforcement wore familiarity like armor. Many deputies had grown up together. They played softball in the summers, hunted in the fall, shared beers after shifts. Complaints were handled internally. Records stayed clean. Patterns went unacknowledged. People trusted the sheriff because they'd always trusted the sheriff. And when trust is inherited instead of examined, it becomes dangerous. Officer Travis Cole fit comfortably into that environment. I am 28 years old. Confidence certain. He believed he understood Redfield because he'd never had to see it from the outside. His father had worked on corrections. His uncle had been a deputy. Authority to him was something you wore and something you protected. He talked often about outsiders. Outsiders changed towns. Outsiders brought problems. Outsiders didn't know how things worked. Cole didn't consider himself racist. He didn't have to. In his mind, racism was loud. Slurs, violence, hate you could point at and condemn. What he practiced was something quieter, more reasonable. Suspicion. He told himself it was instinct. Officer Ryan Hayes rode with him because partnership in policing often meant survival through silence. Hayes was younger, newer, less sure. He noticed things. He felt discomfort. He told himself he was learning, that experience would bring clarity, but clarity never comes when conscience is postponed. On the morning Gene drove into town, Redfield was already awake. Shop owners swept sidewalks. A flag waved lazily outside the post office. Children waited for buses. Everything looked normal. That was the most dangerous part. When Gene pulled into Wilson's grocery, he didn't see himself as an outsider. He saw himself as a man running errands, a widower buying food for one, a veteran maintaining routine. But Cole saw something else. He saw a black man who didn't rush, who stood tall, who moved like he had nowhere to be because he had every right to be there. Cole didn't like that. To him, Gene's calm looked like arrogance. His neat clothes looked like a performance. His age didn't read as fragility. It read as experience. And experience made people unpredictable. Something's off, Cole muttered, watching Gene through the cruiser windshield. Hayes glanced up. He's just shopping. Cole snorted. That's what they always say. They followed Gene to the pharmacy, watched him through the glass. I watched how he spoke to the pharmacist, how he didn't fidget or stumble, how he didn't look afraid. Fear, Cole believed, was honesty. Gene felt their eyes long before he saw them again. He felt it in his shoulders, in the tightening at the base of his skull. Years of training, military and otherwise, had taught him to read rooms, to sense danger without dramatizing it. He told himself not to assume, but survival had taught him that assumptions went both ways. When he stepped outside with his medication and groceries, the parking lot felt too quiet. The sound of a car door closing echoed. Footsteps followed. Excuse me, sir. The voice carried authority, practiced enough to sound reasonable. Gene turned slowly, hands visible because experience had taught him that sudden movements ended lives. Yes, officer. Cole stood too close. Close enough to invade space. Close enough to assert control. Hayes lingered just behind him, uncertain. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area, Cole said, eyes scanning Gene's car, his bags, his face. Mind telling us what you're doing here today? The question wasn't really a question. It was a test, Jean answered calmly. I'm picking up groceries and my prescription. I live on Maple Street. Cole's eyes narrowed. You've been standing around watching people. I was organizing my groceries, Jean replied. Bread and eggs separate. Hayes shifted, uncomfortable. Cole asked for ID. Jean reached for his wallet slowly, narrating his movements because history demanded it. He handed over his license and VA card. Cole studied them longer than necessary, as if looking for permission to escalate. You match the description of someone we're looking for, Cole said casually. Jean felt the familiar ache bloom in his chest. Not fear, but weariness. May I ask what the description is, officer? Cole's jaw tightened. Male, black, older, driving an older car. Jean nodded slowly. That's a broad description. Cole bristled. Are you questioning police work? No, sir, Jean said. Just trying to understand. Understanding had never been the goal. Cole stepped toward the car. Mind if we take a look inside? Before Jean could answer, the door opened. I do not consent to a search, Jean said clearly. Cole ignored him. Bystanders had begun to notice now. Phones came out. Murmurs spread. The town that preferred quiet was being asked to witness something uncomfortable. Cole found the pharmacy bag and held it up. What's this? My heart medication, Jean replied. You can see the label. Cole opened the bag anyway, shaking the bottle like a prize. These look illegal. Hayes finally spoke. They're prescribed. Cole shot him a look that said, remember your place. At that moment, Jean understood something painful and precise. Redfield was not surprised by this. It was only inconvenienced by the attention. The cuffs came out. Cold metal, public eyes. A humiliation practiced enough to feel routine. Jean did not resist. He did not argue. He did not beg. Because he knew that dignity, in moments like this, was not about stopping what was happening. It was about surviving it without becoming what the system expected him to be. As Cole led him toward the cruiser, Jean caught his reflection in the car window. An old man, well-dressed, hands bound, a man who had given his life to a country that still questioned his right to stand in a parking lot without permission. Redfield watched. Some filmed, some turned away, some nodded, satisfied that order was being maintained. And in that silence, in that collective decision not to interfere, the town revealed its truth. Racism did not always wear a hood. Sometimes it wore a badge, sometimes it wore a smile, and sometimes it simply looked the other way. Excuse me, sir. Excuse me, sir. The words themselves were ordinary, polite even. They could have belonged to a grocery clerk or a stranger asking for directions. But tone carried history, and Jean Walker heard it immediately. The practiced authority wrapped in false courtesy, the kind that didn't ask for cooperation so much as it announced expectation. He turned slowly. Years of training guided his body before his thoughts could catch up. Hands visible, movements measured, no sudden shifts. He had taught these rules to young airmen once, not in classrooms, but in quiet side conversations meant to keep them alive when procedures failed. Yes, officer, Jean said. Officer Travis Cole stood too close. Close enough that Jean could smell the coffee on his breath, could feel the invisible line of personal space being deliberately crossed. Cole's hand rested near his belt, not on his weapon, but not far from it either, an unspoken reminder of who controlled the situation. Officer Ryan Hayes lingered half a step behind, eyes moving between Jean and his partner, already uncertain, already aware that something about this interaction was slipping out of the ordinary. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area, Cole said, his gaze sweeping over Jean's Buick, the grocery bags, the pharmacy receipt still peeking from his pocket. Mind telling us what you're doing here today? Jean understood the question for what it was. Not curiosity, not concerned. It was a ritual, rehearsed and familiar, performed countless times across the country in parking lots just like this one. I'm running errands, Jean replied evenly. Groceries and my prescription. I live here in town. Cole's eyebrows lifted slightly, not in interest, but in doubt. Where exactly do you live? Maple Street. Cole nodded, as if filing the information away. though Jean suspected it would never be used. "You been here a while?" "3 years. And you're just standing around watching people?" Cole pressed. Jean glanced at the bags in his hands. "I was organizing my groceries, bread and eggs separate." Hayes shifted his weight. He looked like a man who wanted to say something and didn't yet know how. Cole stared at Jean, eyes narrowing in a way that Jean recognized instantly. It was the look of someone searching for justification rather than truth. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Cole said. Jean felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear, he had learned long ago how to manage that, but the heavier sensation of inevitability. Still, he nodded. "Of course." He moved slowly, narrating his actions because survival had taught him that silence could be misinterpreted. "I'm reaching into my pocket for my wallet." Cole didn't respond. He watched every movement as if expecting Jean's hands to transform into something dangerous midair. Jean handed over his driver's license and VA identification card. Cole studied them with exaggerated focus, holding them long enough to make the moment uncomfortable. Hayes leaned closer, glanced at the cards, then looked away again. "You know," Cole said casually, "you match the description of someone we're looking for in connection with a robbery." Jean's jaw tightened, just slightly. "May I ask what the description was, officer?" he asked. Cole's eyes flicked up sharply. "Male, black, older, driving an older model sedan." Jean nodded once. "That's very broad. Could apply to a number of people." Cole's tone hardened. "Are you questioning police work?" "No, sir," Jean replied. "Just trying to understand." Understanding was not welcome. Cole handed the IDs to Hayes, then stepped past Jean toward the Buick. "Mind if we take a look inside your vehicle?" It wasn't phrased like a request. Jean turned his head slightly, tracking the movement. "I don't consent to a search, officer." Cole opened the passenger door anyway. That moment, that simple, deliberate disregard, cut deeper than anything that came after. It was the moment Jean understood that his rights were optional in this interaction, that compliance had already been redefined as obstruction. Cole rifled through the glove compartment with careless familiarity, papers spilling onto the seat. Hayes stood frozen, eyes fixed on the ground. Bystanders had begun to notice now. A woman across the lot lifted her phone. A man near the entrance slowed his walk. Whispers rippled outward. Cole straightened, holding up the pharmacy bag. "What's this?" "My prescription heart medication," Jean said calmly. "You can see the label." Cole opened the bag, shook the bottle lightly. "These look like illegal pills to me." Hayes looked up sharply. "They're clearly prescribed." Cole shot him a look sharp enough to cut. People disguise illegal drugs all the time. Jean felt heat rise in his chest, the kind that came from indignation restrained too long. "Those were prescribed by my doctor at the VA clinic. You can call the pharmacist to verify." Cole glanced around, noticed the phones, the attention. Instead of retreating, he doubled down. "Sir, place your hands behind your back." The words landed with finality. "On what charge?" Jean asked quietly. "Interfering with an investigation. Possible possession of controlled substances." Hayes swallowed hard. Jean looked at him then, not accusatory, not angry, just searching. "You know this isn't right," he said softly. Hayes looked away. The cuffs came out. Jean turned slowly, positioning his hands behind him without being told again. The metal closed around his wrists, cold and unyielding. Pain shot through his joints, but he didn't flinch. 78 years of living, 35 years of service, and still, this. As Cole guided him toward the cruiser, Jean caught sight of his reflection in the window. An old man, neatly dressed, hands bound like a lesson for anyone watching. And people were watching, some with phones raised, some with eyes averted, some with quiet approval. No one intervened. The cruiser door closed with a hollow thud that felt final, though Jean knew better. He sat upright in the back seat, posture intact, even as the car began to move. Every bump in the road sent a jolt through his wrists. He stared straight ahead, refusing to let pain dictate his expression. He had endured worse. Long nights in hostile territory, cramped transports under threat, rooms where the fate of others hinged on information he carried alone. But none of those moments had stripped him of dignity the way this one did. Because this wasn't about war or enemies or secrets. This was about being black in a country that asked for loyalty but rationed respect. In the front seat, Cole spoke to Hayes as if Gene weren't there. Told you something was off about him? Always walking around like he owns the place. Hayes didn't respond. Gene closed his eyes briefly, not to escape, but to steady himself. He thought of Margaret, of her hands squeezing his whenever tension rose. He thought of Daniel, of the work his son did fighting systems just like this one. He checked his watch by instinct. His weekly check-in call was in less than 2 hours. Missing it would raise questions that would ripple outward in ways Cole could not imagine. The cruiser turned onto the road leading to the sheriff's station. The building came into view, squat and unremarkable, a place Gene had driven past many times without incident. Until today. As they pulled into the lot, Gene felt something settle over him, not resignation, but resolve. This humiliation, this injustice would not be allowed to shrink him. If this moment was meant to teach a lesson, then it would not be the one Cole intended. Because dignity, Gene knew, was not weakness. It was evidence. And evidence had a way of speaking, eventually. The search they had no right to do. The back seat of the cruiser smelled like disinfectant and old sweat, a sharp, sour reminder that many bodies had been carried through this space without ceremony or care. Gene Walker sat upright, shoulders squared, wrists burning where the cuffs bit into skin already tender with age. He did not slump. He did not sigh. He stared straight ahead and breathed through the pain the way he had learned to breathe through fear. The car rolled forward, tires hummed against asphalt. Redfield passed by in pieces. Storefronts, mailboxes, a playground with bright plastic slides that caught the sun. Normal life, unfolding as if nothing were happening, as if a man weren't being quietly erased from his own story. In the front seat, Officer Travis Cole spoke like Gene wasn't there. I don't like it, he said. Guys like that. Always calm, always watching. Officer Ryan Hayes said nothing. Gene closed his eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to steady the rhythm of his breath. He had learned long ago that control, real control, came from refusing to let others decide what lived inside you. Outside, they could take your time, your freedom, your dignity if they were careless enough. Inside was yours. The cruiser turned into the sheriff's lot. The building was squat and familiar, brick walls softened by years of sun and rain. Gene had driven past it dozens of times without incident, a structure that had never asked anything of him, until now. Cole opened the door with a tug that pulled Gene forward. Let's go. Gene stepped out carefully. His knees protested, but he ignored them. He walked with the deliberate pace of a man who refused to be hurried by humiliation. Deputies inside looked up as Cole led him through the door, eyes flicking from the cuffs to Gene's face, then away again. A desk sergeant with thinning hair and tired eyes glanced at the report Cole slapped onto the counter. What have we got? Suspicious behavior. Possible narcotics, Cole said. The sergeant picked up Gene's VA card, his eyebrows lifting almost imperceptibly. He looked at Gene again, this time longer. Air Force, he said. Chief Master Sergeant. Gene nodded once. The sergeant hesitated. Something like doubt passed over his face. He looked back at Cole. You sure about this? Cole didn't hesitate. Process him. The words stung. Gene was led to the fingerprinting station. The cuffs were removed just long enough to press his fingers onto the scanner, one by one. Each beep felt like punctuation, periods placed at the end of statements no one had allowed him to finish. As his prints were captured, Gene felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Anticipation. He knew what those prints would touch once they entered the system. He knew the doors they would knock on. He did not know how quickly anyone would answer. He was photographed next. The camera flashed. The light was harsh, unkind. He stared straight ahead, refusing to look smaller than he was. Personal items were inventoried and dropped into a plastic bin. Wallet, keys, watch. His watch lingered in the deputy's hand a moment longer than necessary. Nice, the deputy muttered. Gene said nothing. Phone call, the desk sergeant said, gesturing toward the wall. Gene picked up the receiver and dialed from memory. His son's number was etched into his mind the way coordinates once had been. Daniel answered on the third ring. Dad, is everything okay? I've been arrested, Jean said evenly. I'm at the sheriff's station. Silence. Then, what? On what charges? They're claiming suspicious behavior. They're questioning my medication. The line filled with the sound of Daniel moving, papers shuffling, anger breaking through professional calm. That's profiling, he said. I'm on my way. Jean closed his eyes briefly. Take your time, and don't say anything to anyone yet. Dad, I know, Jean said softly. I love you. The call ended. Jean was led down a short hallway to the holding cells. The door clanged shut behind him with a sound that carried more weight than it should have. The cell was small, concrete bench, stainless steel toilet, walls that absorbed sound instead of echoing it back. Two men already sat inside. One, a middle-aged Latino man in work clothes, nodded respectfully. The other, younger and pale, leaned against the wall, eyes darting with the restlessness of withdrawal. What do they get you for, old-timer? The Latino man asked. Jean managed a small smile. Existing, he said. While black. The man snorted, humor edged with bitterness. Broken taillight, he said. But really, working construction while brown. They shook hands through the space between them. A quiet solidarity formed, born not of shared crimes but shared understanding. The younger man spoke next. You don't look like you belong here. Jean met his eyes. Neither do you, he said gently. But here we are. As they talked, Jean felt the familiar ache settle deeper. This was the part no one filmed. The waiting, the small talk that kept despair at bay, the knowledge that for many this cell was not a brief interruption, but a revolving door. Outside, the desk sergeant frowned at his computer screen. That's odd, he muttered. What? Hayes asked. The system flagged him, the sergeant said. Federal hold. Details are encrypted. Hayes' stomach dropped. Encrypted? I've never seen one like this. Hayes glanced toward the hallway that led to the cells, then back at Cole, who was laughing with another deputy near the coffee machine. Something tightened in Hayes' chest. Meanwhile, far from Redfield, in a room with no windows and too many screens, Jean's fingerprints triggered an alert that changed the air. Analyst paused mid-keystroke. A screen flashed red. A name appeared that did not belong in a county system. Eugene Walker, classification, protected. Within seconds, hands moved faster. Phones were lifted. Voices dropped. In Redfield, Jean leaned back against the concrete wall, listening to the low hum of the building. He thought of Margaret, of the way she used to straighten his collar before formal events, her fingers lingering just a second longer than necessary. You belong in every room you walk into, she used to say. He wondered what she would think of this one. Time passed strangely in the cell. Minutes stretched. Conversations drifted and returned. Eventually the door opened, and the desk sergeant stood there, his expression unreadable. Mr. Walker, he said, Sheriff wants to see you. Jean rose slowly. His joints protested again. He ignored them. As he stepped back into the hallway, he caught Hayes' eye. The young officer looked like a man standing on the edge of a decision. Sir, Hayes said quietly, are you okay? Jean studied him for a moment. He saw the conflict there, the fear of consequence wrestling with the pull of conscience. I will be, Jean said. Whether I should have to be is another question. Hayes swallowed. In the sheriff's office, Frank Holloway stood with his hands braced on the desk, papers scattered like evidence he hadn't meant to collect. He looked up as Jean entered, his expression shifting from irritation to unease. Mr. Walker, he began, there's been some confusion. Jean met his gaze steadily. Confusion doesn't put handcuffs on a man, Sheriff. Choices do. Before Holloway could respond, the phone on his desk rang. He picked it up, listened, and felt the color drain from his face. Yes, sir, he said. Of course, sir. We'll cooperate fully. He hung up slowly. Who was that? Jean asked. Holloway hesitated. The Pentagon. Jean nodded once. He had expected as much. Outside, the sound of helicopters grew louder, their blades chopping the air with urgency that could no longer be ignored. Deputies looked up from their desks. Conversation stopped. Redfield was about to learn something it had long avoided. That the quiet suffering of one man could awaken systems far larger than a town's comfort. That dignity, once violated, had a way of calling witnesses, and that when rights were treated as optional, consequences rarely remained local. Gene Walker stood in the middle of the sheriff's office, wrists still aching, spine straight, eyes calm. He did not know exactly what would happen next, but he knew this. The search they had no right to do had uncovered far more than a pill bottle. It had exposed a truth Redfield could no longer pretend not to see. America in a holding cell. The holding cell was quieter than Gene Walker expected. Not silent, never silent, but muted in the way places designed for waiting always were. The concrete walls absorbed sound, swallowing it before it could grow teeth. The fluorescent light hummed faintly overhead, casting everything in a pale, unforgiving glow that flattened faces and erased shadows. Time moved differently here. Minutes stretched thin, seconds stacked on top of each other without meaning. Gene sat on the bench with his back straight, hands folded loosely in his lap now that the cuffs were gone. His wrists throbbed in dull pulses, each beat a reminder that dignity could be bruised even when it wasn't broken. He focused on breathing, slow and deliberate, the way he had learned decades ago in places where panic was a luxury no one survived. Across from him, Miguel, the construction worker, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. He smelled faintly of dust and sweat, the honest labor of a body that worked because it had to. The younger man, Ethan, paced in short, restless bursts, rubbing his arms as if trying to warm himself from the inside out. "Funny thing," Miguel said after a while, breaking the silence. "They always say it's just procedure." Gene nodded. "Procedure without fairness becomes a habit. Habit becomes culture." Miguel let out a humorless laugh. "You sound like you've thought about this before." "I've lived it," Gene said. Ethan stopped pacing and looked at him. "You were in the military, right?" "Yes." Ethan shook his head slowly. "Doesn't make sense. I mean, you served." Gene met his eyes, gentle but steady. "Service doesn't cancel prejudice. Sometimes it just hides it better." The words settled between them, heavy with truth. Ethan swallowed, as if trying to reconcile the world he believed in with the one he was seeing. Outside the cell, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Keys jingled. A radio crackled with a voice too low to understand. Gene listened without moving. Listening was an old skill. It had kept him alive more than once. He thought of Margaret again, not sharply, not painfully, but with a quiet ache that never quite left. She would have hated this place, hated the smell, the cold light, the way men were reduced to case numbers and last names. She believed deeply in kindness, in speaking up when something wasn't right. Gene used to tease her for it, call it optimism. Now he understood it as courage. Miguel leaned back against the wall. "You think anything's going to happen?" he asked. Gene considered the question carefully. He knew more than he was saying. He also knew that hope, when given carelessly, could wound. "I think the truth has a way of moving," he said finally. "Sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once." In the front office, Officer Ryan Hayes stood near the desk, watching the sergeant scroll through screens he clearly did not understand. Hayes' stomach felt tight, knotted with a sensation he could no longer ignore. "Anything?" Hayes asked. The sergeant shook his head. "Just that flag. Federal. Encrypted. I can't access a thing." Hayes glanced toward the hallway that led to the holding cells. He thought of Gene sitting there, calm, composed, older than his father, younger than his conscience. He thought of the moment in the parking lot when Gene had said, "You know this isn't right." Hayes had known. That was the worst part. He had known, and he had done nothing. Across the room, Travis Cole laughed at something on his phone, unbothered. The sound grated against Hayes' nerves. Cole had that kind of confidence, the kind that came from never having to doubt the system because the system had always worked for him. "Hey," Hayes said quietly, approaching the desk again. "Shouldn't we, I don't know, call someone? That flag?" The sergeant glanced at him sharply. "You want to make this worse?" Hayes fell silent. Worse, as if it wasn't already wrong. In the holding cell, Gene shifted slightly, easing the pressure on his lower back. He had spent years in uncomfortable places, transport planes, windowless rooms, foreign safe houses. But none had felt quite like this. Those places had been dangerous, yes, but they had been purposeful. This was different. This was meaningless harm. Jean watched Ethan pace again, his movements frantic now. "They keep telling me it's just overnight," the young man said, voice cracking. "Just until I sober up. But last time they said that, it was 3 days." Jean felt something tighten in his chest. He reached out and placed a steady hand on the bench between them, grounding rather than consoling. "Listen to me," Jean said quietly. "Whatever happens, you are more than this moment. Do not let them convince you otherwise." Ethan nodded, tears threatening, then turned away. The cell door opened suddenly. The sergeant stood there, flanked by a deputy. "Walker," he said, "you've got another call." Jean rose slowly. Miguel offered a small nod. Ethan whispered, "Good luck." Jean followed the sergeant back down the hallway. The phone rang before he even reached it. "This is Jean." "Mr. Walker," came a woman's voice, professional, precise, unmistakably federal. "This is Special Agent Laura Bennett with the FBI. I need you to answer a few questions." Jean closed his eyes briefly. The machinery had begun to move. "Yes, ma'am." She confirmed his identity, asked about the arrest, the officers involved, and the search. Jean answered clearly, factually, without embellishment. He had learned long ago that truth did not need decoration. "We are addressing the situation," Bennett said. "Please remain calm." Jean allowed himself a small internal smile. "I've been calm my whole life," he replied. When the call ended, the sergeant looked at him differently. Not with respect exactly, but with caution. Back in the cell, Miguel raised an eyebrow. That sounded important. Jean sat again. It was. Ethan stopped pacing. "Does that mean you're getting out?" Jean hesitated. "It means someone is listening." Outside, the sound of helicopters grew louder, no longer distant. Their rhythm pressed against the building, impossible to ignore. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. Hayes looked up sharply. "You hear that?" Cole frowned. "What the hell is going on?" The sergeant's computer chimed again. Insistent, urgent. A message flashed across the screen. He leaned closer, eyes widening. "Sheriff," he called out, "you need to see this." Sheriff Holloway emerged from his office, face already strained. He read the message, then looked up slowly, as if gravity had shifted. "The FBI has requested emergency landing clearance at the municipal airfield," the sergeant said. "ETA 5 minutes." The room went still. Cole's smile vanished. "They're coming here?" Holloway rubbed a hand over his face. "Jesus Christ." Hayes felt his pulse spike. He thought of Jean in the cell, of Miguel, of Ethan, of how easily any of this could have been prevented. In the holding cell, Jean listened as the helicopters drew closer. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel relief. He felt clarity. Because he knew that what was about to happen, whatever its scale, whatever its spectacle, would not undo the harm already done. It would not erase the humiliation, the fear, the quiet confirmation that even a lifetime of service could not shield a black man from suspicion. He also knew something else. If this was how the system responded when one man's name triggered alarms, what did it say about the countless others whose names never did? Miguel looked at him, eyes wide now. "You okay?" Jean nodded. "I'm thinking about all the people who sat in this room before me, about the men who left broken, about the ones who never got calls, about the ones whose pain never made it past these walls." The cell door rattled again. This time the sergeant's voice was different, strained, almost respectful. "Mr. Walker," he said, "the sheriff would like to speak with you." Jean rose, joints aching, spirit steady. As he stepped into the hallway, the building seemed smaller somehow. The air is heavier, the truth pressing in from all sides. America, he thought, was a lot like this holding cell. Some people passed through quickly, barely touched. Others lingered longer than they should. And far too many were told, again and again, that what they were experiencing was normal. It wasn't. It never had been. And as the sound of federal authority descended on Redfield, Gene Walker carried that truth with him, not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. Because dignity, once tested, demanded witness, and silence, he knew, had never saved anyone. The system panics. In a windowless room hundreds of miles away from Redfield, the lights never dimmed. Screens glowed softly against the dark, rows of them lining the walls like watchful eyes that never blinked. This was a place built for vigilance, for moments when silence became dangerous. Analysts sat with headsets on, fingers moving steadily across keyboards, the low hum of machines filling the space between breaths. Most alerts that passed through here were routine. Former intelligence personnel traveling abroad, financial anomalies that turned out to be clerical errors, health notifications from retirees whose bodies were finally collecting the debt of years lived under pressure. At precisely 2:47 p.m., one screen flashed red. Not orange, not yellow, red. Analyst Sarah Nguyen straightened in her chair, the way you did when instinct told you something mattered before your mind caught up. A soft but insistent tone pulsed from her console. Priority level unmistakable. She leaned closer, eyes scanning the text as it populated. Fingerprint match confirmed. Subject, Walker Eugene R. classification, protected. Location, local law enforcement system. Redfield County, NC. Sarah's breath caught. Protected assets did not show up in county jail databases. They just didn't. Her fingers moved quickly now, pulling up additional layers of information. Service history, clearance levels, notes marked restricted, and eyes only. The picture formed with chilling clarity. She turned sharply to her supervisor. Commander Reynolds, we've got a priority one. Commander David Reynolds was already on his feet, crossing the room before she finished speaking. He read the screen once, then again, slower the second time. Walker, he said quietly. The Walker. Sarah nodded. Fingerprints were entered less than 10 minutes ago. He appears to be under arrest. Reynolds didn't swear often. When he did, it meant something had gone very wrong. He picked up the secure phone. This is Reynolds. Authorization code Tango 7 Whiskey. I need Director Whitman. Now. Across the country, Claire Whitman was walking into a briefing she no longer cared about. Her phone vibrated once. An override signal few people were authorized to trigger. She stopped mid-step. Yes, she said. Director, Reynolds said, voice tight. Eugene Walker has been detained by local law enforcement in Redfield County, North Carolina. Fingerprints were just entered into their system. There was a pause on the line. What are the charges? Whitman asked. Unclear. Initial report cites suspicious behavior and possible narcotics. The substance appears to be prescription medication. The silence that followed was heavier than any raised voice. Send me everything, Whitman said at last. Footage, officer names, arrest reports, and get me a team. I'm going in. Yes, ma'am. The line went dead. Whitman turned, already moving. Clear the helicopter, she said to her aide. Tactical team, DOJ liaison. Now. As she strode down the corridor, memories surfaced uninvited. A younger version of herself, years earlier, standing in a foreign capital with compromised cover and no clean exit. A calm voice in her ear, steady and unyielding. Focus. Breathe. Do exactly what I say. Eugene Walker. He had seen what others missed. He had shielded her when politics demanded a scapegoat. He had risked his career so hers would not end before it began. Now someone had put him in handcuffs for standing in a parking lot. That was not a mistake. That was an insult the system could not ignore. Back in Redfield, the sheriff's station vibrated with a tension no one could name. The sound of helicopters was no longer distant. It pressed against the walls, rattling windows, forcing everyone inside to acknowledge that something larger than the town had arrived. Sheriff Frank Holloway stood at the front desk, phone still in his hand, knuckles white. He had just hung up with a voice that did not ask questions, only demanded cooperation. Across the room, Officer Travis Cole's confidence had begun to fray. This is ridiculous, and he muttered. All this over some old guy? Ryan Hayes stared at him, disbelief finally overtaking fear. Do you hear yourself? Cole scoffed. I did my job. Hayes felt something snap. No, he said quietly. You did what you wanted. The sergeant's computer chimed again, this time not with an error, but with an incoming directive. Page after page printed from the fax machine, each stamped with seals that made Holloway's stomach drop. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Investigation Authorization, immediate federal oversight granted. Outside, squad cars pulled up alongside black SUVs. Agents moved with purpose, coordinating, securing, documenting. News cameras rolled. Community members gathered, their voices rising in a mixture of anger, disbelief, and long-held pain finally given air. Inside the holding cell, Gene Walker felt the shift before he heard it. The air changed. The building's rhythm altered, like a heartbeat skipping and then racing to catch up. He stood as footsteps approached, measured, unfamiliar. The cell door opened. "Mr. Walker," the sergeant said, his tone different now. "Careful. Please come with me." Gene stepped into the hallway just as the front doors of the station burst open. Federal agents filled the space with disciplined efficiency, securing exits, identifying themselves, establishing control. At their center walked Claire Whitman, her expression composed, eyes sharp. Her gaze found Gene instantly. For just a fraction of a second, something human passed between them. Recognition, relief, anger carefully contained. "Remove those cuffs," she ordered. They were already gone, but the command echoed anyway, symbolic as much as practical. Whitman turned to Holloway. "By order of the Attorney General, this department is now under federal authority pending investigation." Holloway nodded numbly. "We'll cooperate." "You will," Whitman said. "Fully." She stepped closer to Gene. "Are you all right?" Gene nodded. "I am." Her jaw tightened. "You should never have had to be." Around them, the station hummed with activity, agents accessing systems, deputies being interviewed, evidence catalog. Cole stood off to the side now, smaller somehow, the weight of his actions finally pressing in. Ryan Hayes approached Whitman, voice shaking but determined. "Director, I need to make a statement." Whitman looked at him steadily. "Go ahead." Hayes swallowed. "Officer Cole has a history of targeting black residents. I've seen him plant evidence. I didn't report it. I should have." The words hung in the air, raw and irreversible. Cole lunged forward. "You little—" Two agents moved instantly, restraining him. Whitman didn't flinch. "You've just made the right choice," she said to Hayes. "Late, but right." Gene watched it all with a strange calm. He felt no satisfaction, no vindictive pleasure, only a deep, aching awareness of how much damage had been done before this moment ever arrived. Whitman turned back to him. "Chief," she said quietly, using the title again, "this is going to move fast now." Gene met her gaze. "It needs to move far, too." She nodded. Outside, a chant rose from the crowd, voices layered with grief and hope, demanding accountability, demanding recognition. Signs lifted into the air, phones recorded, history, messy and imperfect, unfolded in real time. Inside, Gene Walker stood at the center of a storm he had not sought. He thought of Miguel, of Ethan, of the countless names he would never know. People whose dignity had been tested without backup, without alarms, without helicopters. The system had panicked because it had recognized him. What Gene wanted, what the moment demanded, was for it to learn to recognize everyone else. As Whitman began issuing orders, as agents documented years of quiet abuse, as Redfield confronted the truth it had politely ignored, Gene felt a familiar sense of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. Not because he was special, but because he had survived long enough to be heard. And sometimes that was enough to force a reckoning. Justice, healing, and a stronger America. Redfield had never seen federal power up close, not like this. The sheriff's station, usually a place where voices stayed local and consequences stayed quiet, was suddenly filled with motion so precise it looked rehearsed. Agents moved in clean lines, securing doors, collecting devices, copying hard drives, photographing paperwork that had sat for years in file cabinets no one outside this building was ever meant to open. Radios crackled, names were called, orders given. The whole place felt like it had been lifted out of the town's control and placed under a microscope. For the deputies who'd built their lives around the comfort of how things are done, it felt like the floor had shifted. For the people outside, the ones who'd been stopped, searched, questioned, watched, it felt like the world had finally looked their way. Eugene Gene Walker stood near the sheriff's office doorway while paramedics examined his wrists. their gloved fingers pressed gently against bruised skin. It wasn't the kind of injury that would land you in surgery, but it was the kind that told a story. A story that would never be called an accident if the right person decided to pay attention. "Does it hurt?" one paramedic asked. "Only when I remember why," Jean replied, voice calm. Claire Whitman heard him. Her expression tightened, not with emotion she couldn't control, but with emotion she refused to waste. She turned toward Sheriff Frank Holloway, who sat behind his desk like a man waiting for a verdict. "Sheriff," she said, "I want every record related to Officer Travis Cole's arrest for the past 3 years. Body camera footage, complaint forms, internal reviews, dismissals. I want names and signatures and timestamps. Everything." Holloway's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Yes, Director." Jean watched him carefully. Holloway wasn't a cartoon villain. He wasn't foaming at the mouth, yelling slurs. He looked like a tired man who had convinced himself that what he didn't confront wasn't his fault. That was the problem. Racism didn't always require hatred. Sometimes it only required comfort, the comfort of looking away. Outside, the crowd had swelled. Word spread faster than truth ever did. People arrived with phones, with signs, with tight faces that carried decades of stories they usually kept locked behind teeth. Reverend Isaiah Brooks stood near the front, speaking calmly to reporters, his voice steady but his eyes burning with something old. When Jean's son Daniel pushed through the doors, his suit was rumpled from the drive, and his expression sharpened by fear that had turned into fury. "Dad," he breathed when he saw him. He crossed the room quickly, then stopped short, because even in that moment, he read Jean's posture, the way his father held himself like someone who refused to crumble. "I'm all right," Jean said quietly, pulling Daniel into a brief embrace. "Just sore wrists." Daniel's eyes flicked to the bruises anyway, then to Claire Whitman. Recognition flared. "Director Whitman," he said, voice controlled but tense. Whitman nodded once. "Mr. Walker." "She did not come for me because she's kind," Jean said softly to Daniel, as if teaching him in the room at the same time. "She came because what happened was wrong." Whitman's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. "Both can be true," she said. The station phones rang constantly now. The fax machine continued spitting out federal orders like the building itself was confessing. Deputies were separated and interviewed. The tone had changed. No more casual jokes, no more swagger. Just nervous glances and the dawning understanding that the same system they'd relied on to protect them might now expose them. In a conference room, Officer Ryan Hayes sat with 2 agents. Hands clasped so tightly his knuckles whitened. His voice shook as he spoke, but the words came anyway, each one costing him something. "I've seen Cole target black residents," he said. "He'd stop them for nothing. He'd search them. He'd talk to them like they were already guilty." "Did you see him plant evidence?" an agent asked. Hayes stared at the table. "Yes. More than once." Hayes swallowed hard. "Yes. Why didn't you report it?" The question hung there, heavy and unforgiving. Hayes's eyes filled with tears. He blinked back quickly, ashamed. "Because I didn't want to be alone," he said finally, voice cracking, "and because I told myself it wasn't my problem." Silence. Then the agent spoke softly. "That's how it becomes everyone's problem." Back in the main area, Travis Cole's face had gone pale. He tried to laugh, to shrug it off, to act like this was some misunderstanding that could be smoothed over by the right handshake. But handshakes didn't erase the footage, and the footage didn't care about his intentions. When 2 agents approached him and asked him to stand, Cole's voice rose. "This is ridiculous. You can't—" "Yes," one agent interrupted, firm but calm. "We can." Cole jerked his arm away. He looked around the room as if expecting someone, anyone, to back him up. A deputy he'd hunted with, a sergeant who'd laughed at his jokes, the sheriff who'd let complaints die in paperwork. But no one moved. For the first time, Cole looked small, not because he was powerless, he had abused power plenty, but because the illusion of protection had cracked. He was being led outside now, past cameras, past the community he'd treated like prey, into the back of a federal vehicle. The crowd's reaction was complicated. Some cheered, some cried, some simply stared, as if they had been waiting their whole lives to see proof that consequence was possible. Gene didn't cheer. He watched quietly, heart heavy, because he knew that Cole wasn't the only one. Cole was just the one whose hand had tightened the cuffs today. The rest of the town, the ones who said nothing, filmed but didn't intervene, dismissed complaints, shrugged at patterns, had all helped. That was the part America hated admitting. A deputy approached Gene hesitantly. "Mr. Walker," he said, avoiding eye contact. I'm sorry." Gene studied him. "Are you sorry because it happened," he asked, "or because it happened to someone the government cares about?" The deputy flinched like he'd been slapped. Gene's voice stayed level. "That's not cruelty. That's the question that has to be asked." Claire Whitman stepped outside for a brief press conference as evening light began to soften the edges of the town. Cameras clustered. Microphones rose. The crowd pressed in behind the press line. Whitman stood at the podium with the calm of someone who had delivered difficult truths before. "Today," she began, "the FBI has initiated a civil rights investigation into the Redfield County Sheriff's Office. What happened to Eugene Walker is unacceptable. No American should face discrimination because of the color of their skin." She paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "But let me be clear," she continued. "This investigation is not about one incident. It is about a pattern. It is about what happens when institutions are allowed to operate without accountability, when complaints are dismissed, when silence becomes policy." She turned slightly. "Mr. Walker has agreed to say a few words." Gene stepped forward. The crowd quieted. He didn't look like a man who had just been humiliated, because he refused to give them that satisfaction. He looked like a man who had survived so much that he no longer needed to prove anything. "My name is Eugene Walker," he said, voice deep and steady. "I'm 68 years old. I served this country for 35 years. I did my duty in places most people will never see, and in ways I can't fully discuss." A few murmurs rippled. Gene held up a hand gently. "But today," he continued, "none of that mattered. Today I was just a black man in a parking lot." The words landed like a weight. "The difference," Gene said, "is that when my fingerprints entered the system, people with power noticed. People moved, helicopters flew, orders printed, the doors opened." He glanced at the crowd, eyes steady. "Most people who experience what I experienced don't get that. They sit in cells. They lose jobs. They lose dignity. Some lose their lives. And the system shrugs because there is no alarm loud enough to force it to care." His throat tightened slightly. He swallowed it down. "If anything good is going to come from what happened today," Gene said, "it can't be that I was rescued. It has to be that Redfield and towns like it decide that no one else should have to be." The crowd erupted in applause. Not the polite kind, the kind that sounded like release. Gene stepped back. Claire Whitman watched him with something like pride, a mentor's pride, a survivor's pride. She leaned toward him slightly. "You turned their humiliation into a mirror," she murmured. Gene's mouth curved faintly. "I'm tired of mirrors," he said. "I want windows." That night, the investigation continued. Records were seized, interviews conducted, evidence gathered, and far beyond Redfield the story spread, because the nation recognized itself in it, whether it wanted to or not. 6 weeks later, consequences arrived in the form of court filings. Travis Cole was charged federally for civil rights violations. The investigation widened, pulling in other officers, policies, and ignored complaints. Sheriff Holloway was placed on administrative leave, while federal oversight moved in under a consent decree that required reforms. Transparent complaint procedures, body camera audits, bias training, community review with real authority. Some residents called it federal overreach. Others called it air finally reaching a room that had been suffocating for generations. Redfield's town hall filled during emergency meetings. Voices rose. Some defended the department. Some finally spoke about things they'd been holding in their chests for years. Gene sat in the front row with Daniel beside him, not as a man seeking vengeance, but as a man seeking change that could outlast headlines. After one especially tense meeting, a young black mother approached Gene, her toddler clinging to her leg. "My brother got arrested last year," she said, voice trembling. "They said they smelled weed. They searched his car, found nothing, still took him in. He lost his job. We filed a complaint. Nothing happened. Her eyes filled. Nothing ever happens. Jean felt the old ache return. The ache of knowing how many stories like that existed. He took a slow breath. Something is happening now, he said softly. Not because the past can be fixed, but because the future can be protected. That was where his next choice came from. Jean used the attention, unwanted, heavy, uncomfortable, and he turned it into work. With Daniel, he created the Redfield Community Justice Foundation, offering legal aid to victims of discriminatory policing, building partnerships, forcing conversations that had been avoided for decades. They launched a scholarship program for minority students pursuing careers in law enforcement and criminal justice. Change doesn't come from identifying what's wrong, Jean told the crowd at the first event, microphone in hand, sun warm on his shoulders. It comes from building what's right. If you want different outcomes, you need different voices in the room. Ryan Hayes stood in the back of that crowd, no longer wearing a badge. He had resigned. The price of telling the truth had been high. Former friends had turned their backs. The department had labeled him a traitor. But the community's leaders had offered him a place on the new oversight board, a second chance to do the right thing more than once. Hayes met Jean's eyes across the crowd. Shame and gratitude tangled together. Jean nodded once. Not forgiveness, not absolution, acknowledgement. A year later, Redfield looked the same in some ways. Same storefronts, same humid summers, same morning routines. But something had shifted beneath the surface. The sheriff's vehicles now carried a new motto: protect, serve, respect. Body cameras were audited. Patrol patterns changed. Officers walked beats in neighborhoods they had once only entered with suspicion. Trust did not return overnight. Trust never does. But fear began to loosen its grip. On the anniversary of the arrest, Jean stood at the opening of a new community justice center, funded by a mix of federal grants and donations from people who had watched his story and felt something stir. Anger, yes, but also possibility. He looked out at a crowd more diverse than Redfield had ever gathered for a single cause. Pastors and business owners, teenagers and retirees, black families and white families, immigrants and veterans. A year ago, Jean said, voice carrying through the auditorium, I was handcuffed for the crime of being black in public. The room held still. Today, he continued, we're not here to celebrate my suffering. We're here to celebrate what you chose to build from it. He gestured behind him to the building, rooms for legal clinics, mediation, youth programs, oversight meetings. This place exists because people decided that love for community has to be stronger than comfort with injustice. He paused, eyes scanning the crowd. And here's the lesson I want us to carry forward, he said. Racism is not just cruelty. It is neglect. It is silent. It is the decision to treat someone else's pain as normal. He let those words settle. But love, Jean said, voice warming, is also a decision. Kindness is a decision. Courage is a decision. He pointed gently, not accusing, but inviting. If you see someone being treated unfairly, speak. If you hear someone being reduced to those people, correct it. If you have power, use it to protect, not to dominate. And if you don't have power, you still have a voice, and you still have the ability to stand next to someone who feels alone. The crowd's eyes glistened. Some nodded. Some wiped tears. America becomes stronger, Jean said. Not when we pretend racism is gone, but when we refuse to let it live comfortably among us. He drew a breath, and the last words came out like a promise. We are not condemned to repeat harm. We can choose a better way. We can choose each other. The applause that followed wasn't just for him. It was for the idea that people could change, that communities could confront themselves without collapsing, that dignity could survive humiliation and turn into something that healed. That night, Jean drove home and sat on his porch as the sun sank over Maple Street. The neighborhood was quiet. A police cruiser passed slowly, then continued without stopping. A small thing, a small, enormous thing. Daniel called him. Dad, he said, voice thick with pride. The president mentioned Redfield in a speech today. They're looking at the oversight model. Jean chuckled softly. Good, he said. Maybe fewer people will have to learn this lesson the hard way. He hung up and looked out into the darkening street. He thought of Margaret, of what she would have wanted. Not revenge, not recognition, just decency. Gene closed his eyes and made a silent promise. Not to the government, not to a director, not to a town, but to the people who never got helicopters, never got alarms, never got their names said with respect. He would keep building, because justice was not just a law, it was a practice. And love, real love for America, was not blind loyalty. It was the courage to make it better. What happened in this story was not an accident, and it wasn't just about one man, one officer, or one town. It was about a system that grows dangerous when good people stay silent. It was about how racism survives, not only through hatred, but through comfort, indifference, and the decision to look away. And it was about what becomes possible when someone refuses to shrink, refuses to surrender dignity, and chooses to turn pain into purpose. This story teaches us something powerful, that human worth does not come from uniforms, titles, or connections, that no amount of achievement should be required to deserve respect, and that a stronger America is built not by denying injustice, but by facing it together with honesty, courage, and love. Real change begins when we choose empathy over fear, when we speak up instead of staying quiet, when we help one another, protect one another, and recognize that justice for one is justice for all. If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or question, then you are part of the change this country needs. Subscribe to the Racist Reality channel for more true, powerful stories that expose racism, confront injustice, and remind us of our shared humanity. Visit the channel and watch more videos that challenge the silence and call us toward compassion, accountability, and unity. Because America does not become better by pretending we are already there. America becomes better when people like you choose to care. Thank you for watching. Stand for dignity, stand for love, and never stop believing that we can build a stronger America together.